I'd like to take a couple minutes here and talk about blending modes, how to use them, when to use them, because even though they can be a little intimidating when you first start playing with them, they can be a very powerful tool. Let me show you a little bit about how they work. I'm putting a gradient on top of this image. This is just a straight black to white gradient, and I'm going to show you using some blending modes how these two images would blend together. I'm going to highlight the layer that I intend to blend, which is always the layer that's on top, the one above the base layer. The normal blending mode, you can see the entire gradient. If I come down to dissolve, there's really no difference here. But when I get to darken, what happens here is that the parts of the underlying images that are darker than the layer that I'm blending show through that layer. Now, if I go down one more to multiply, you can see that the effect is enhanced even more. Now, I'm going to show you in a few minutes how you can use this to your advantage. If I go down and use some of the others, like the color burn, you can see that you get some kind of strange effects in addition to the darkening of the top image. Now, if I go down into the lighten area, this next group lightens the image. So what it will do is areas that are lighter than the top image will show through the top image. And you can see that this works with lighten and with screen, as well as with some of these others, the color dodge, etc. When you get down into the overlay group, then what you're looking at is an increase in contrast. I can hide my gradient layer here, and you can see that where the gradient layer is overlaid on top of the base layer, the contrast is increased. Now I can go to the next one, which is soft light, and you can see the contrast is increased again, but nowhere near as much. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump down here into difference, and you can see that I've got a negative image out here. This might be nice if you're trying to line up two images that are identical. Then you get into exclusion and subtract and divide. When we get into hue and saturation, you can see that it's kind of manipulating the hue of the image here. We'll get into that more in just a little bit. And then the image, we have actually we're desaturating the bottom image using the top image. And here we're taking out the color. You can see this is almost a grayscale image coming across here. And then when we get to luminosity mode, that really looks awful here. But it works in other types of situations. Okay, let's take this back to normal and let's look at some practical applications of this. The base layer here is a little light. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to darken it down. Well, I have my normal tools within Photoshop. I've got levels, I've got curves, I've got exposure, things like that. But I want to use blending modes here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this image just by dragging it down here to the new layer icon, and you can see it duplicated the image. I'm going to make sure that the top of those two images is highlighted, and I'm going to go to the multiply blending mode. And you can see as I turn this off and on what multiply has done. All of a sudden I'm getting a lot more detail in this background and in the sky, and even to some extent here in the water. Now of course I'm also darkening my foreground, and there are other ways of handling this to manipulate this image. We'll get into that a little bit when we start talking about layer masking. Okay, so let's turn this layer off. Let's just trash this layer. Now you can trash a layer just by bringing it down here to the trash can at the bottom of the layers panel. And let's look at another one. I'm going to turn this off and let's look at this image, which is very dark. Well, I can lighten that image using a blending mode. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to duplicate this image, except this time rather than dragging it down to the new image, to the new layer icon, I'm going to hit Command or Control J, which is the shortcut that duplicates the image. Now I'm going to go, and since I want to lighten this, I'm going to go to Screen and look at what happens. This is before, and now this is using Screen. This is going to be interesting because if I want to make this even lighter, I can just hit the Command J again and duplicate that top layer a couple more times, and I get it to where I want it. If it's a little too bright, then I can go down to my opacity, and I can take the opacity of the top layer down just a little bit so that I can get this image where I want it. Again, I've gotten my foreground where I want it, but I have sacrificed the sky and the ocean a little bit. But that wasn't the point of this particular exercise. Okay, let's look at something else. Let's say I want to tint this image. Well, I've got this brown layer up here, and I just turn that on. Well, of course, that's doing a little bit more than tinting because I can't see the underlying image. I could go through with my opacity and, whoops, wrong one. I could come up here, highlight the brown layer. I'd have to make sure that I'm working on the correct layer here. I can bring my opacity down, and you can see that the underlying layers are coming through, but it really doesn't have the effect that I want it to have. So let's come back over to 100% here, and I'm going to go, rather than the normal blending mode, let's come down here to color. And look at what happened. All of a sudden, I've got a nice brown-toned image. Now, I can take my opacity now and crank my opacity back a little, and you can see that some of the greens of the hills are coming back in. So I have a nice warm tone image that has maybe a nice mystical feel to it. Let's bring this back over to 100%, and let's take a look at one of the other blend modes. Let's go to Hue, and you can see that Hue, if I turn this off and on, Hue actually gives me a similar result, but nowhere near as pronounced as if I go into color. If I use luminosity here, it doesn't do anything for me. If I use saturation, well, I get some pretty strange colors in there, and you may want something like that. But in this case, I'd suggest you go into color, blend mode, and then crank the opacity back to where it actually looks good to you. Okay, one of the other things I can do here is let's take this texture layer and turn that on, and I'm going to blend the texture layer in. Well, which blend mode do I want to use? I don't know. I'm going to try a bunch of them. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to make sure that my Move tool is selected up here. I can use my V key on the keyboard to get there. I'm going to hold my Shift key down and start hitting the plus key. This is dissolve. That didn't do anything. Well, that's interesting. Look at what darken did. It put the texture only in the sky there. Multiply, and then we're looking at the color burn. Here we go, a linear burn. That looks kind of interesting. What I want to do is I want to get a texture over this whole image, and if I bring back my opacity a little bit, I can see that I've got texture in the highlights, I've got texture in the shadow, all over the place. But let's bring it back up to 100% and let's look at some more. There's my darker color, lighten. Well, that's not what I want. Screen, color dodge, overlay. There we go. Overlay looks kind of nice. It gives me a texture through the whole thing. And here's soft light. Soft light gives me a much softer texture that lets more of the image through. And I can just go through and try these other things. And depending on the image, it may or may not look great, or it may or may not look awful. Okay, that's blending and putting a texture on an image. The other thing that I want to do here is I'd like to go in and do some dodging and burning. And let me show you how to do that. Let's back this off a little bit. Let's put this on here. I'm going to highlight this area, this layer, because I want my dodge burn layer to be above that. Now, I got to create a dodge burn layer. How do I do that? I didn't see a dodge burn blending mode or anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just click on the new layer button. But I'm going to hold down my Option or Alt key when I do it. The reason is that when I click, I get a dialog box here where I can name my layer. I'll call it Dodge Burn. Just like that. But before I click OK, I'm going to come down and I'm going to change my mode. We are talking about blending modes here, and I'm going to make it soft light. And I'm going to fill that with a soft light neutral color, which is 50% gray. Now, if I look over here in my panel, you can see my dodge burn layer. It looks gray here, but I don't see any gray out here at all. Well, let's take a look. I'm going to hold my Option key down and just click on the dodge burn eye over here, which will turn off everything but dodge burn. And you can see it actually is gray. So now let's turn these back on. And what can I do with this? Well, let me show you. If I paint on this with white, it's not going to paint white. It is going to actually, let's go here, bring my paintbrush up. If I paint on here with white, it's not going to paint white, it's going to paint lighter. So let's bring our opacity up to 100% here, just so that we can see how this works. And watch, I'm going to paint with white right across the middle of this image. And look at what happened. It didn't put white out there, it made it lighter. I'm going to hit Command or Control Z to undo that, and I'm going to show you that if I switch to black, what's going to happen is I'm not going to be painting black, I'm actually painting dark. Okay, so that's what the dodge burn layer does. So now let's use that. Since we have black already selected, let's make our brush a little bit bigger here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an opacity of about 50% here, because I know I want to make this thing pretty dark. And I'm just going to go in and I'm going to darken my sky. Again, I'm painting dark out here. I'm not painting black, I'm painting dark. There we go. Okay. Now, if I want to lighten up some of my foreground, for instance some of this rock, what I do is I switch so that I'm painting with white. I'm going to make my brush smaller here, and rather than going with 50% opacity, well, let's keep it 50% opacity right now. I'm just going to go in and look at how I'm making this rock lighter. I could actually lighten up some of the areas in here like that. I didn't blend that very nicely, but you can see what happens. Typically, when you use this tool, you want to put your opacity down somewhere around 20% so that you can build up the lightness just a little bit at a time. And then you just take your time and you just bring it up to where you need it. And the same thing about burning in.